The silence that follows the final beat of a human heart is perhaps the loudest sound in the known universe. It marks the precise boundary between the tangible world we navigate daily and the immense unknown that waits in the shadows. For thousands of years, civilization has tried to illuminate this darkness with candles and prayers and scientific theories. We tell ourselves that death is simply a dreamless sleep or a fading to black, like a cinema screen cutting power. Yet there are thousands of voices rising from the cold earth that contradict this comforting emptiness. They are the voices of those who have crossed the ultimate threshold and were violently pulled back to the land of the living. They speak not of darkness, but of a reality more vivid and terrifying than life itself. Imagine standing in a sterile hospital room where the air smells of antiseptic and stale coffee. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor is the only tether holding a young man named Arthur directly to this existence. The year is 1943, and the world outside is tearing itself apart in the throes of the Second World War. Arthur lies broken on the bed, with his injuries sustained not on the battlefield, but in a training accident that crushed his chest. The nurses move with hushed urgency, but their eyes betray the grim truth that medical science has done all it can. The doctor checks his pocket watch and marks the time of death in a leather notebook. The room falls still, and the sheet is pulled up. To the observers, Arthur is gone. But Arthur is not gone in the way the doctor believes. At the exact moment the heart monitor flattens into a singular tone, Arthur feels a sudden and violent snapping sensation within his chest. It is not painful, but rather it feels like a heavy chain has been severed. He suddenly finds himself floating near the ceiling, looking down at the tableau of death below him. He sees the bald spot on the head of the doctor and the tear rolling down the cheek of the young nurse. He tries to shout at them to tell them he is still present, but his voice has no sound in this heavy air. He is invisible and intangible, a ghost in his own life story. The panic begins to set in as he realizes the tether to his physical vessel has been cut. The hospital room begins to dissolve at the edges like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The walls fade into a swirling gray mist that feels cold and damp against his spiritual form. Arthur turns away from his body and faces a long and dark tunnel that seems to spin with a centrifugal force. He is pulled forward not by his own legs, but by an irresistible magnetic gravity. The sensation of speed is overwhelming. As he hurtles through this void, he can hear the wind rushing past his ears, and it sounds like a chorus of thousands of whispering voices. Some are weeping, and others are laughing in a manic tone that chills him to the core. He is moving deeper into a territory where the laws of physics hold no dominion. As the darkness of the tunnel gives way, Arthur finds himself standing in a landscape that defies all logic. The grass under his feet is not green, but a vibrant pulsing color that he has never seen on Earth. The sky above is not blue, but a shimmering gold that radiates a warmth that penetrates his very soul. He sees a city in the distance, constructed of what looks like pure crystal and glass. It is beautiful, but there is an underlying eeriness to the perfection. It is too still and too silent. He realizes he is entirely alone in this vast paradise. The isolation strikes him harder than the physical pain of his death ever did. He walks toward the city hoping to find a familiar face or a guide. Suddenly, a figure materializes before him, blocking the path to the crystal city. It is not an angel with wings or a demon with horns, but a man in a simple gray suit that looks decades out of style. The man has no eyes, only deep pools of shadow where the sockets should be. He does not speak with a mouth, but Arthur hears the voice resonate directly inside his mind. The voice is cold and lacks any human empathy. It tells Arthur that he has arrived too early and that his account is not yet settled. The figure points a pale finger back toward the darkness from which Arthur came. The rejection is absolute. Arthur pleads to stay, feeling that returning to his broken body is a fate worse than death. The force that pulls him back is violent and immediate. It feels as if a hook has snagged his navel and is reeling him in through the dark tunnel. He screams as the golden light fades and the gray mist swallows him whole once again. He falls through the void, tumbling uncontrollably, until he slams back into the heaviness of his physical form. He wakes up gasping for air on the hospital bed, terrifying the nurse who was preparing his body for the morgue. Arthur lived for another 40 years, but he was never the same man. He spoke often of the man with the hollow eyes and the crystal city. He spent his remaining days looking over his shoulder, as if he expected the man in the gray suit to come for him again. This story of Arthur is just one among millions of recorded near-death experiences, or NDEs. While modern pop culture often paints these events as blissful journeys into the light, the historical reality is far more complex and often deeply disturbing. Throughout history, cultures have whispered about the geography of the afterlife. The ancient Greeks spoke of the river Styx and the gloomy realm of Hades, where shades wandered aimlessly. The Tibetans wrote the Book of the Dead, describing the terrifying Bardo states filled with wrathful deities that the soul must navigate. These were not mere metaphors, but guidebooks for a journey that every human being fears they must eventually take alone. In the late 19th century, a geologist named Albert Heim fell from a mountain while climbing in the Swiss Alps. During the seconds of his fall, which must have felt like hours, he experienced a phenomenon that would later be catalogued as a life review. He saw his entire existence play out before his eyes like a panoramic film. He felt no fear, only a detached curiosity. He saw every childhood memory and every kindness and every cruelty he had ever inflicted. When he miraculously survived the landing in the snow, he devoted his life to collecting similar stories from other survivors of fatal accidents. He found that the experience of the life review was nearly universal, suggesting a judgment mechanism built into the dying brain. However, not all who cross the threshold encounter peace or judgment. There is a darker category of these phenomena, known as distressing or negative near-death experiences. These accounts are often suppressed or ignored because they do not fit the comforting narrative of heaven waiting for us all. Dr. Morris Rawlings, a cardiologist who resuscitated many patients, documented cases where individuals woke up screaming in terror. They did not see a light or a tunnel. They saw a void of absolute nothingness or landscapes of fire and torment. They encountered entities that were malicious and predatory. These patients would often beg the doctors not to let them die again because they were terrified of what waited for them in the dark. Consider the case of a woman named Maria in 1977. She suffered a cardiac arrest in a Seattle hospital and was clinically dead. During the resuscitation efforts, she found herself floating outside the hospital building. She later described seeing a tennis shoe sitting on a ledge on the third floor of the North Wing. It was a detail impossible for her to know from her bed or even from the ground. A hospital social worker went to the location Maria described and found the shoe exactly as she had said. It was an old blue tennis shoe with a wear mark over the little toe. This veridical perception suggests that consciousness may indeed separate from the biology of the brain. The skeptics in the scientific community argue that these experiences are nothing more than the hallucinations of a dying organ. They claim that as oxygen levels in the brain plummet, the visual cortex misfires, creating the tunnel effect. They argue that the release of endorphins and ketamine, like chemicals, creates the feeling of peace and detachment. The life review is explained as the temporal lobe dumping memory files in a last-ditch effort to find a solution to impending death. To the materialist, the near-death experience is a biological glitch, a final flickering of electricity before the machine shuts down forever. But this explanation fails to account for the cases where patients see and hear things while their brain activity is flat. The most famous challenge to the materialist view is the case of Pam Reynolds in 1991. She underwent a rare surgical procedure known as hypothermic cardiac arrest to remove a giant aneurysm in her brain. Her body temperature was lowered to 60 degrees. Her heart was stopped. Her blood was drained from her head. Her brain waves were completely flat. For all intents and purposes, she was a corpse on the operating table. Yet during this time, she reported floating above the doctors. She described the pneumatic drill they used on her skull identifying it as looking like an electric toothbrush. She heard the song Hotel California playing in the background. Her accurate recall of events during a period of zero brain activity remains one of the greatest mysteries in medical science. But let us return to the darker corners of this phenomenon. The stories of hellish near-death experiences are the ones that keep researchers awake at night. A man named Howard Storm, an art professor and avowed atheist, suffered a rupture in his stomach while on a tour in Europe. As he lay dying in a French hospital, he found himself standing outside his body. He heard voices calling to him from the hallway. They were friendly at first, inviting him to come with them. He followed these shadowy figures into a gloom that grew thicker with every step. Suddenly, the demeanor of the entities changed. They became aggressive and violent, tearing at his spiritual form with claws and teeth. He realized too late that he had been lured into a trap. Storm described the place as a realm of absolute hopelessness, where the inhabitants were consumed by their own hatred and selfishness. There was no fire and brimstone in the traditional sense, but rather a psychological torture of isolation and abuse. He claimed he was saved only when he called out a prayer he remembered from childhood, causing the entities to recoil from a sudden light. When he woke up in his hospital bed, he was a changed man. The arrogance and anger that had defined his life were gone, replaced by a humble terror of the reality he had glimpsed. He spent the rest of his life warning others that the afterlife is not guaranteed to be a paradise. These negative experiences often share a common theme of the void. It is a space of total sensory deprivation. Survivors describe floating in an infinite blackness where they are completely alone with their own thoughts. There is no sound and no light and no sensation of time. It is an eternal, solitary confinement. For some, this is a peaceful resting state, but for others, it is the ultimate horror, to be stripped of everything that makes you human and left as a singular point of consciousness in the dark is a fate that drives the soul to the brink of madness. It is a reflection of the existential dread that we all carry deep within our subconscious. The entities encountered in these realms vary wildly across cultures, but they share frightening similarities. In the West, people see demons or gray figures. In India, they see the Yamaduts, the messengers of the Lord of Death, who drag the soul away with ropes. In Japan, they see the Oni. Despite the cultural skin, the core experience is the same. There is a sense of judgment and a sense of hierarchy. The entities often seem to be feeding on the fear or the confusion of the newly dead. It suggests an ecosystem of the spirit world that is just as predatory and dangerous as the food chain in the physical world. There is also the phenomenon of the shared death experience. This occurs when a loved one sitting at the bedside of the dying person suddenly finds themselves pulled along for part of the journey. They may see the light filling the room, or feel the sensation of rising out of their bodies alongside the dying. They might see the deceased relatives gathering in the corners of the room, waiting to collect the soul. These shared experiences are difficult for science to explain as mass hallucinations. They suggest that the boundary between the worlds becomes porous at the moment of death, allowing the living a brief and terrifying glimpse through the veil. The aftermath of a near-death experience is often traumatic for the survivor. They return to their bodies with a profound sense of alienation. The concerns of daily life, like money and status and politics, seem utterly trivial compared to the reality they have seen. They often have trouble relating to their families and friends, who cannot understand the magnitude of what has happened. Divorce rates among NDE survivors are statistically high. They are haunted by the knowledge of what waits on the other side. They have peeked behind the curtain of the universe and found that the wizard is real and terrifyingly powerful. Some survivors report developing strange new abilities after their return. They claim to be more sensitive to electromagnetic fields, often unable to wear watches because the batteries drain instantly. They speak of increased intuition or even psychic flashes where they know things about strangers that they should not know. It is as if the high voltage of the death experience has rewired their nervous system, leaving them permanently altered. They are like deep-sea divers who have surfaced too quickly and are forever suffering from the spiritual bends. They walk among us, but they no longer fully belong to this world. The medical community remains divided. For every neurosurgeon who writes a bestseller about his journey to heaven, there is another who publishes a paper debunking it as a chemical cascade. But science struggles to explain the sheer transformative power of the event. Hallucinations generally fade like dreams. The near-death experience remains vivid and life-altering for decades. The memory does not decay. It stands as a pillar of absolute truth in the mind of the survivor. They do not believe they saw the afterlife. They claim they know it with a certainty that surpasses any earthly knowledge. We must also consider the frightening possibility that the afterlife is not a singular place, but a reflection of our own expectations and subconscious state. If a man dies with a heart full of hate, does he create his own hell? If a woman dies in a state of fear, does she manifest the demons that torment her? The Tibetan Book of the Dead suggests exactly this. It teaches that the wrathful deities are merely projections of the mind's own unresolved karma. This implies that we are building our own afterlife every single day with our thoughts and our actions. We are the architects of our own eternal prison or paradise. The story of a young boy in Oklahoma adds another layer to this mystery. After drowning in a frozen pond, he was dead for nearly an hour. When he was revived, he spoke of meeting a sister he never knew he had. He described her name and what she looked like in great detail. His parents were shocked because they had indeed lost a daughter to a miscarriage years before the boy was born. They had never told him about her. How could a hallucinating brain invent a specific family member that the conscious mind did not know existed? Stories like this one are the pebbles that shatter the glass house of materialist skepticism. But for every reunion with a lost sister, there is a darker encounter. There are whispers of the shadow man, a recurring figure in many NDE accounts. He is often described as a tall silhouette, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat. He stands silently watching the dying soul, or sometimes beckoning them toward a place of gloom. Is he a guardian or a predator? Is he the grim reaper of folklore, or something more ancient? His presence brings a feeling of intense cold and dread. Survivors who see him often refuse to speak of it for fear that saying his name might summon him back. The landscape of the near-death experience also includes the barrier. Survivors often describe reaching a fence or a river or a line in the sand that they instinctively know they cannot cross. To cross, it means there is no return. They see loved ones standing on the other side, waving them back. They feel a desperate longing to cross over, to leave behind the pain and the struggle of biological life. But the choice is rarely theirs. They are sent back by a force greater than themselves. They are slammed back into their bodies, often with the sensation of falling from a great height or being sucked through a narrow tube. History is filled with famous figures who may have had NDEs. Plato ends his Republic with the myth of a soldier who returns from the dead to describe the cosmic structure of the afterlife. The painter Hieronymus Bosch created visions of heaven and hell that look suspiciously like the reports of modern NDE survivors. Did he see the tunnel of light himself? Did he glimpse the dark void? It is possible that the great religious art and literature of the world is inspired not by imagination, but by the direct reporting of those who walked the borderlands of death. The physical toll of these experiences is also notable. Many survivors return with unexplained physical healings, cancers that vanish, and infections that clear up overnight. But others return with strange sensitivities to light and sound. They cannot tolerate bright artificial lights or loud noises. They prefer silence and solitude. It is as if their sensory organs have been tuned to a different frequency. And the noise of the modern world is now unbearable static. They become hermits living on the fringe of a society that they can no longer understand. As we advance in medical technology, we are bringing more people back from the brink than ever before. This means the number of NDE accounts is skyrocketing. We are creating a generation of people who have technically died and returned. They are a new demographic of the revenant. What does this mean for our culture? Will their stories eventually force a shift in our scientific paradigm? Or will we continue to dismiss them as anomalies? The sheer volume of consistent reports is becoming a tidal wave that the walls of skepticism may not be able to hold back forever. Yet the most chilling thought is reserved for the end. If these glimpses are real, then death is not an escape from the self. It is a continuation. All the fears and the guilts and the loves and the hates we carry are not extinguished by the grave. We take them with us. We step into a realm where thoughts are instant reality, and where there is nowhere to hide from who we truly are. The mask of the physical body is stripped away, and the naked soul is left exposed to the universe. In the end, the stories of near-death experiences are ghost stories in the truest sense. They are not about sheets and chains, but about the haunting of the living by the reality of the dead. They remind us that the wall between here and there is paper thin. They whisper that we are walking on a tightrope over an infinite abyss, and one day, for each of us, the rope will snap. The question remains, will we fall into the light, or will we fall into the dark? The answer waits for us in the final silence. The lingering dread of these tales comes from their consistency. From the soldier in World War II to the housewife in Seattle, the core elements remain terrifyingly similar. The tunnel and the light, and the life review and the judgment. It suggests a structure to the afterlife that is independent of our belief. It suggests that the system is waiting, whether we believe in it or not. And as you lay in bed tonight in the dark, listening to the beating of your own heart, remember that it is the only thing keeping you from that gray mist. One skipped beat is all it takes to turn the page. So we are left with the uneasy conclusion that death is not the end of the horror, but perhaps only the beginning of a much stranger and more complex journey. The witnesses have come back and given their testimony. The evidence is stacked in the corner of the room like a pile of cold bones. We can choose to look away, or we can stare into the hollow eyes of the truth. But eventually, the man in the gray suit comes for us all. And on that day, we will no longer need to wonder. We will know